Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. Valerie Clark was seen off to retirement by the entire hospital. In the surgery department, where she had worked as an operating room nurse for nearly 40 years. A beautiful table was laid out, and in the middle of it there was a huge fruit and cream cake with a beautiful inscription, "Valerie is the soul of the department." Valerie Clark herself, who turned 67 earlier this year, sat in a chair with an almost untouched glass of white wine in her hand and received touching and heartfelt congratulations from her colleagues. "Valerie, my dear, congratulations on your well-deserved retirement." Patricia Anderson, aflush with excitement, who worked as a cardiologist at the hospital, made the toast. "Over the years, I have seen many times that you are not only an amazing specialist in your difficult and extremely important work, but also a person of incredible heart and generosity. You, Valerie Clark, can always be relied upon. Cheers to you and all the best. Cheers. Hooray." Immediately, everyone else picked up, and the residence room where the farewell was held instantly exploded with the clinking of tapping glasses and congratulations. Thank you, my dears." Valerie Clark thanked them later when the laughter had subsided. "If you only knew how much I would miss all of you. I have so many wonderful, bright memories with this hospital." The elderly woman could no longer finish, as tears of tenderness and nostalgia for the years she had worked in the place covered her eyes. Colleagues reassured the nurse, and then the residence room was once again filled with heartfelt conversation. Valerie Clark looked at her guests with a kind but a little sad smile. Certainly she was very pleased that all of them had decided to arrange such a wonderful party for her. However, the woman still couldn't fully accept the idea that tomorrow she wouldn't have to come here anymore. The elderly woman was well aware that sooner or later any story has to end, and in her many years of work came the inevitable finale, after which Valerie Clark awaited only uncertainty. Of course, she took her retirement for granted and was not offended at the head doctor who had called her in for a serious talk a couple of weeks ago. But still, deep in her heart, she somehow felt that it was a little too early for her to retire. Valerie Clark had enough energy for another couple of years of fruitful work, especially since she always loved her job and was sincerely glad every time she managed to help someone. The woman was ready to put up with any inconveniences, whether it was low wages or forced overtime, just to be able to continue working and be needed. Valerie Clark didn't want to think about it, but she still often thought that it was their new supervisor, a young professional who had come to them from the capital, who had offered to retire her. The elderly woman remembered the look of disdain he gave her on his first day on the job when he was getting to know their entire department, and how, later, she overheard him talking to the lead surgeon by chance. "How can you keep that old nag with you? She probably won't even be able to find the right instrument during surgery. Personally, I don't need this museum piece in my department." The new head of surgery warned the surgeon. Valerie Clark felt so hurt for herself that she could not hold back her tears. She locked herself in the office and cried for a long time before she was able to calm down and return to her workplace. Even her blood pressure spiked from nerves, and she had never complained about it much. It so happened that Valerie Clark did not have children. She and her husband could not conceive, no matter how many times they tried, and no matter what eminent doctors they turned to. When she was young, our heroine was very worried about it. But then she accepted it. She decided that if she could not have her own child, she would just help people. Until recently, everything in the Clark family had been going smoothly. Valerie Clark worked in a hospital, and James Hatcher was chief accountant in a trading firm. But 7 years ago, the nurse's spouse became seriously ill. Severe illness turned out to be stronger, and after the death of her husband, Valerie Clark was inconsolable, and the first time literally sleep at work, trying thus to drown her mental pain. Later, when the first shock receded and acceptance came, The nurse began to take things much more calmly and continued to perform her duties as usual. Now, the job that had become her last outlet would be gone. Valerie Clark looked at her colleagues, and there was a luminous sadness in her eyes. Left without her favorite job, the elderly woman began to feel bored and longing. It was especially difficult for her in the first couple of weeks, when she, now and then, rushed to go to work early in the morning, and only a few minutes after waking up she realized that she did not have to rush anywhere. It went on like this for another month or so before the woman finally got used to the fact that she was now a pensioner. Well, that's okay, Valerie Clark thought as she sorted through the old things in the pantry. There's always enough to do at home. Now I'll get my hands on something I never had time for before. Because of the change of waking up time and the absence of the usual eating schedule, the elderly woman's body soon began to malfunction and responded to the new lifestyle with unexpectedly severe pain in the abdomen. The first time it happened, Valerie Clark was sitting by the stove in the evening, looking at old photographs in her family album. She ran her fingers warmly over the black and white wedding photo in which she and her husband had been depicted so young and beautiful and happy. "Kevin, I miss you so much, my darling," the woman thought before she felt something in her abdomen sudden cut with force. She immediately stung and grabbed the sore spot, but the pain had already begun to slowly subside. Former nurse took the pill and walked around the room for a while, hoping that the spasm would subside on its own. And it did, but only for a short time. When the woman was almost relaxed and stopped thinking about it, the pain happened again. But this time it was even stronger and longer. She didn't want to go to the hospital, but she made an appointment to see a gastroenterologist. If it were up to Valerie Clark, she would not be standing in line outside the doctor's office now, but she would be watering flowers in her garden. But there was nowhere else to go. The pain was getting worse, and her mood was constantly falling lower and lower. Having finally passed all the tests, the woman waited for the doctor's appointment. When she was invited into the office and called her last name, the woman immediately noticed an alarming shadow run across the face of her attending doctor. "Doctor, can you please tell me what I have there?" Valerie Clark nodded toward her medical records, which the doctor was studying carefully at the time. The doctor took a deep breath and then looked his patient straight in the eyes. "I'll be honest with you, Valerie Clark. I can't give you much pleasure. Your tests are very bad." The elderly woman's heart gave an alarming tingle. At this point, the former nurse finally realized that she had some serious health problems. The doctor slowly took his gaze away from the woman's face, and looking at the results of the tests, he said quietly, "To my great regret, the chances of a positive outcome with this diagnosis are extremely slim." "What? My God, how could it be? Why?" Out loud, the older woman said, trying to speak calmly and confidently, "Stephen Harold, I've been in medicine for 40 years. You don't have to lie to me. I'd like to know exactly how much time I have left." He looked at her with sincere regret. 6 months at the most," the doctor replied. "I will prescribe medication and treatment that will at least partially relieve the pain. In any case, you will have time and strength to finish all your work." Thanking the doctor for his honesty, Valerie Clark took her prescription and referral for treatment and left the hospital. Sitting on a bench in a small park, the woman wept bitterly. She could not understand how she had not noticed the first signs of such a serious disease before. On the other hand, her husband was also unaware of his illness until the last moment. The former nurse had always hoped to live a long, even if not as happy life as she would have liked. And then the doctor's words sounded to her like a verdict. Naturally, the elderly woman was not going to give up without a fight. But deep in her heart, she was well aware that at her age, the disease would surely take over. The long gray days stretched on, filled for Valerie Clark with sadness and a sense of utter hopelessness. Depression consumed the elderly woman almost completely, and she felt exhausted all the time. Thoughts of the impending end gripped Valerie Clark's mind more and more. It only exacerbated her feeling of loneliness and inner emptiness, in place of which a huge lump of longing and fear was forming. There was nothing the poor woman could do about it. She felt as if she was being pulled into a bottomless abyss, and she saw no way out of her situation. One day, as Valerie Clark was returning home from the store carrying a small bag of groceries in each hand, she saw an unusual sight. Under the railway bridge, she saw a homeless guy and a large but very thin dog whose right front paw was bandaged with a wide blackened scarf. The dog was lying on a makeshift blanket, and the vagrant was sitting beside him, breathing heavily and looking unhappy while he gently groped his ribs. He pressed somewhere in the area of his rib cage and immediately heard a low, subtle wail, a whimper from the dog, who was obviously in a lot of pain. "Okay, I got it," the homeless man said quietly. "Whoa. Be patient a little longer, baby. Let me get you some more water." The young man rummaged through his duffel bag and pulled out a wide plastic bowl and a bottle of clean water. He poured water into the bowl and put it in front of the dog. The dog immediately began to greedily lap up the water. The homeless man stroked the dog's head affectionately and smiled. Valerie Clark noticed that he looked awfully thin and haggard himself. The young man's cheeks were sunken, overgrown with a thick beard, and his curly hair was sticking out from under a dirty wool cap in unkempt strands that I wanted to cut or try to brush. The elderly woman's heart tickled with pity, and she could not pass by. She decided to ask him what had happened. "I picked the poor guy up," the young homeless man explained. "He was run over on the road, and his paw was badly injured. Of course, I bandaged it up as best I could, but it looked like he had a broken rib, too. I could hardly drag him away from the road, or else he would have been run over by a truck. I hope he makes it. Only if his paw is badly bruised, he will limp, but it's not that bad." The boy stroked the dog again, and the dog joyfully put his beautiful, like a Caucasian sheepdog, face under his arm. Despite the pain, the animal felt that he was cared for, and therefore, as much as it could, it showed its gratitude to the rescuer. "What are you two doing sitting outside?" Valerie Clark asked cautiously. "You should have taken him somewhere warm, on the contrary." The look on the homeless man's face immediately turned sullen. "I don't have a home. I've been living on the street for a long time now. We're under the bridge for a while Baxter's resting. Then we'll look for another place." Everything inside Valerie Clark certainly froze. "Baxter. Have you given him a name yet?" She almost shed a tear. She asked the boy, and then, unexpectedly even to herself, she added, "Listen, let's take your doggy and we'll go to my place. I will help you. I have been working as a nurse for many years. I will help your shaggy friend to get back on his feet, and we'll examine the wound and disinfect it." The homeless man was visibly embarrassed. He had not expected such a generous offer from a complete stranger. "But you don't know me at all. It's inconvenient, somehow. And how will I go to you with a dog? You probably need peace and quiet." Valerie Clark looked at him with a slight chuckle. "Don't worry about my peace. I have more than enough of it as it is. Come on, what are you going to do? Sit here under the bridge." The guy thought for a while, then nodded. "All right, I'll just put everything together and let's go. And if I have to, I can even sleep in your yard overnight without going inside. I understand everything. I just want to save Baxter and get out, and I don't have to worry about me. I can survive anything." The homeless man smiled at Valerie Clark and quickly gathered his belongings and threw the bag over his shoulders, then picked up the whining dog and followed the elderly nurse. Along the way they met, and the woman learned that her new acquaintance's name was Danny Brown, and that he had lived on the street most of his life. The guy was only in his early 30s, but he seemed to have an unenviable fate. When they arrived at her house, the first thing they did was treat the dog's wounds properly and change the bandages. Valerie Clark had some leftover tripe in the refrigerator, which she planned to use to make soup. But now, they were given to Baxter for dinner. The dog was incredibly happy to get hot and fragrant food and even wagged his tail quietly, thus showing his affection to the mistress of the house. In the meantime, Danny took a shower, where for the first time in a long time, he was able to wash and shave properly. After that, he looked about 5 years younger. When he came out of the bathroom, Valerie Clark did not even recognize him at first. Standing in front of her was a tall man with beautiful dark blonde curly hair and bright blue eyes. The woman put a large plate of hot vegetable stew in front of the young man and offered to take him out to dinner. Danny sincerely thanked the woman for her help. During the meal, they got to talking, and Valerie Clark learned a little more about her new acquaintance. The young man said that his mother raised him practically alone, working several jobs and unsuccessfully trying to cope with an alcoholic roommate who spent most of his time on the couch, hugging a bottle of beer. She worked as a cook in the school cafeteria during the day, Danny told the former nurse, and at night, at the same school, she washed the floors just to feed and clothe me. I couldn't tell you how much it hurt for her, and that bastard didn't even look in her direction when she came home. Half dead. He did not even try to help her, and he did not want to work either. He said that there was no use when he had enough money. Danny's face darkened and his palm involuntarily clenched into a fist. If you only knew, Valerie Clark, how much I wanted to throw him down the stairs by the scruff of the neck. I wish he hadn't made fun of my mother again. But I was only 10 years old, and I couldn't answer back. Sometimes he would beat my mother so badly that she couldn't walk. Valerie Clark only shook her head sympathetically. Danny continued. In the end, my mother could not stand the beatings and died. And my stepfather, after that, he finally went to all kinds of trouble. He turned our apartment into a drinking den, and one day black realtors came to us disguised as his drinking buddies. They got my stepfather so drunk that he gave them our apartment for good measure. The man sighed heavily. I knew right away that they could do anything to us that night, so I ran away. I was 15 at the time. I still don't know if my stepfather is still alive or if fate punished him for everything bad. Danny explained to the woman that he had been wandering the streets for a while, trying to survive as best he could, and had even ended up getting mixed up with a bad group of older guys who did petty theft. Eventually, it was one of the raids that got them arrested by the police. Danny then had to serve 2 years in a minimum security prison. When he got out, he decided that was it. He was done with crime once and for all. Since then, he has kept his promise and makes his living through small part-time jobs as a longshoreman or construction worker. That's how he lives. Valerie Clark looked at the boy with sincere sympathy. After hearing Danny's touching story, she felt even more sympathy for him. The woman watched Danny and Baxter eat the stew and porridge he had prepared with gusto, and at that moment she felt her heart began to gradually return to life. For the first time since Valerie Clark's terrible diagnosis, she wanted to live and care for someone. Danny and Baxter went to live at Valerie Clark's house, and in the old woman's house you could feel a man's hand at once. Danny repaired furniture, repaired a cornice in the hall that had long been falling to the side, helped the woman with replacing bathroom fixtures, and in general helped the former nurse with household chores as much as he could. Valerie Clark began to regard the young homeless man as a close relative, and often in conversation she called Danny Sonny, and he didn't mind. Baxter, too, was slowly but surely on the mend. For the time being, he lived with them in the same room where his master slept. Danny and Valerie Clark checked on the dog regularly, and each time they were relieved to see him getting better. But no matter how much Danny did for his benefactress, all the neighbors in the neighborhood disliked him and were maliciously whispering behind Valerie Clark's back, inventing the most monstrous tales about the boy's true intentions. They thought Danny was just waiting for the right moment to rip that lunatic off, or worse, do something to her. The homeless man himself tried not to pay attention to these provocations and continued to help Valerie Clark in everything. And after a while, Danny met a wonderful woman. Her name was Mary. She worked as a cashier in a local grocery store, and she immediately noticed a tall, handsome guy who smiled at her friendly every time he came to shop. The young people got to know each other and began to talk often, feeling a warm affection for each other. One day, Danny decided to meet a young woman after his shift to walk her home. But what was his surprise when he saw beside her a little 6-year-old boy whom Mary was gently holding by the hand. "Hi," said Danny cheerfully to the baby. "And I thought I'd pick your mom up from work. It's getting dark now. It's not safe for you to be out on the streets alone." With these words, Danny pulled a charming bouquet of wildflowers from behind his back, which he handed to a confused but clearly delighted Mary. Hello, Dee, Uncle," the boy said to him politely, and then, just in case, pressed himself closer to his mother's leg. Danny pretended not to notice his severe stutter, only looked questioningly at Mary. "I'll tell you later," she answered briefly, and introduced the former homeless man to her son, whose name was Joe. As Danny walked Mary home, she had time to tell him that she would love to keep in touch with him, but that she was going through a difficult divorce process from her ex-husband, Ethan. "Ethan is an alcoholic," Mary told him with a sigh, "and he started drinking after we were married. Before that, he'd held it together, tried to work, and then," the young saleswoman sighed sadly, "I tried to cure him. I took him to a witch doctor, and I did everything I could. I thought that when Joe was born, he would quit. He wouldn't have time for that, the baby. But no way. He just started drinking more and more. Joe started stuttering because of him." "So what happened?" Danny asked. "It was my own fault," Mary began. "I had to go to work that day. My partner was sick and I had no one to cover for her. So I stupidly left Joe with that bastard." They went to the park to go on the rides. Mary took a few deep breaths before continuing, and at that moment, Danny noticed the tears glistening in the woman's eyes. "That Roscoe, my husband, couldn't resist buying himself a beer. He went to the stall and forgot about his son. And there, at the same time, a stray dog ran by and threw himself at my boy." Mary spoke almost in a whisper so that Joe couldn't hear anything. Joe was only 4 years old. He was terrified when the animal started barking and growling. Thank God some caring people were there. They used sticks to chase the stray dog away. And Ethan, when he heard the screams and came over, pretended that none of this had ever happened. Can you imagine? The neighbors told me about it. I was so shocked. And Joe, he's been stuttering ever since. I can't help him. And he's afraid of dogs. If he sees one, he starts crying. What a bastard. The only thing Danny could say was that he was struck to the core. Mary hugged Joe tightly. From that moment on, it was over between us. He and I now live like roommates. We share the same apartment. He's still mad as hell. Danny nodded understandingly and assured the woman that he would wait for her as long as it took, because he only wanted to be with her. A couple of days later, Danny had the pleasure of seeing this Ethan in person as he molested his, now almost ex-wife, right in the store. Mary, what did I tell you? Give me that kopeck right now. Can't you see I need a hangover? Mary said something quietly to her husband, who became even more furious and began to smash the nearby counter. Danny couldn't take it anymore and approached the man and roughly sacked him. Didn't you hear what you were told? The girl clearly told you that she doesn't want to see you anymore. Get out of here before I call the police. I don't get it. Who's the voice around here? Why are you so worried about my woman? Danny Ethan asked with a slurred tongue. You got a boyfriend or something? Instead of answering, Danny deftly slipped his hand under his armpit and in one motion twisted the stubborn customer into a ram's horn, then escorted Ethan out of the store and threatened him that next time he would not be ceremonious with him and immediately call a police force. Pussycat. Ethan hissed after him. You want to steal my woman? You'll never get away with it. We'll get even. Holding a grudge against the homeless man, Ethan limped back home. Meanwhile, Valerie Clark fussed in the kitchen, preparing for the return of her lodger. Never before had the elderly nurse felt so uplifted. She never regretted for a minute that she had kept Danny and his dog. In some ways, this boy really was almost like a son to her, and that wonderful feeling of late motherhood literally cheered the woman up. A month flew by in the pleasant chores of the household, and even the pain in her stomach dulled somewhat, but the elderly nurse's fear of death did not disappear. Valerie Clark worried that the relief was only temporary, and soon her condition would worsen to the point where she could not get out of bed. The woman knew that this was inevitable with patients as they approached their imminent end. Fearing that she did not have much time left, Valerie Clark decided to draw up a will, and when everything was ready, invited a notary. "Are you crazy?" The notary frowned as he read the pensioner's last will. "You're going to bequeath all your property to this tramp from the street. Come to your senses, Valerie Clark. He might just be cheating on you in order to get your home as soon as possible, and you're handing it to that bum on a silver platter. Why would you do that?" "Danny doesn't know anything about it," the nurse shook her head. "If he wanted to, he could have done anything to me a long time ago, but that boy treats me only kindly. He knows nothing about the will, and I have no family and no children. Who am I to leave it all to? But let Danny live here. With his fiancée, it'll be nice for me." The notary was very surprised but remained silent. The client's will is the law, so he signed the document and then left. Another month passed. All that time, Valerie Clark lived life to the fullest and enjoyed those warm moments when she and Danny were visited by Mary and her little son. The woman rocked little Joe on her lap. They all drank tea with homemade sweets and talked a lot. And then she read stories to the boy. The former nurse had bought a book specifically for these evenings, and at these moments, she felt like a grandmother babysitting her beloved grandchild. Sometimes Mary would leave the baby with Valerie Clark to go with Danny to the movies, or just for a walk around town, and then the old woman felt that they were all one friendly family, even though they were technically strangers to each other. The young woman prayed for one thing only, that the court would settle Joe's custody as soon as possible, so she could finally divorce Ethan and leave him the house they shared. Mary didn't want anything from him, especially since Danny had already assured her that he would take her and Joe as soon as the trial was over. He wanted to marry Mary and be a better father to her son than his own alcoholic father to her son than his own alcoholic father. Valerie Clark was only too happy to hear that her dearest people had decided to get married. The woman did not even immediately notice that she was no longer in pain. To be honest, over the past month and a half, her well-being, on the contrary, had improved significantly. Valerie Clark was very surprised by this, and deep in her heart she couldn't help but wonder if this was possible. She was about to die. This mystery was solved after only a couple of days, when the elderly woman came for a routine appointment with her doctor, and this time she saw on his face, instead of the usual sympathy, obvious embarrassment. Valerie Clark, you see. The doctor didn't know how to begin. It turned out that in your tests then, the first time, there was an unfortunate mistake. The lab technician mixed up your material with the material of another person and did not immediately realize it. And now that we've double-checked it and compared it to your last test, you've been misdiagnosed. Valerie Clark, you don't have a tumor. There are some digestive issues, but that can be fixed. "Oh my God," the patient said with a flutter of her arms. "Doctor, is it really true? I'm going to live." "You will live a very long and happy life," the doctor smiled at her. "Don't doubt it." As if on wings, Valerie Clark flew home and told the happy news to Danny and Mary, who was just preparing dinner, feeding Baxter's meat scraps at the same time. Danny and his fiancée were happy to hear that the health of their sweet Valerie Clark was out of danger. Danny went into the yard to chop wood for the evening. It was summer outside and he was working in his t-shirt. Valerie Clark was walking by and she saw the painfully familiar mark of a large oval on his shoulder. She groaned and stopped, unable to cope with her feelings. "What's wrong, Valerie Clark?" Danny asked. taking an attentive look at his hostess's condition. "Your birthmark," the woman explained. "I've seen it before." She said that many years ago, a pregnant woman, in her last month of pregnancy, was brought to the department. The surgeon at the time decided that they had to operate on her because otherwise both she and the baby would die. Valerie Clark herself only helped at the time, but she remembers very well that this girl gave birth to twins, and both twin boys had exactly the same birthmarks on their shoulders. "But that's impossible," Danny marveled. "I've always been an only child, and my mother never told me I had a brother and a twin. There must be some mistake." "There can be no mistake. I have a photographic memory, son. From my youth, I remember faces and other notable things very well. And I'm telling you for sure, you have a brother." Danny didn't know what to say at the time, but in the evening when they were drinking tea together, and he told Mary about it, he hesitated. "Maybe you're right, Valerie Clark," he told her. "Only if I had twins, my mother probably gave them to an orphanage. Where was she going to get to? She was the only one who had raised me." Danny, picturing being separated from his baby brother as a baby, was, of course, very upset. But what could he do now that so much time had passed? Even if Valerie Clark was right, where could he find him now? The man tried to make inquiries at the local passport office, but he could not find out anything there. Gradually, he stopped thinking about it and turned his attention to far more important things. After another month, the court finally divorced Mary and Ethan, and now he and Danny could safely begin preparing for the wedding. The happy couple had no idea that another toughest test lay ahead of them. One evening, drunk Ethan stumbled into Valerie Clark's yard. The man was shouting obscenities and waving his arms, trying to get his ex-wife's attention. He wanted to take Mary and Joe home with him. The woman herself, fearing for her son, hid in the back room. Danny went outside with the obvious intention of punishing the insolent man, and a fight ensued between the men. At one point, Brown didn't see the blade of the long knife Ethan held in his hand gleam in the darkness of the evening dusk. Seconds later, Danny felt a sharp pain in his right side. Immediately, everything in front of the young man's eyes went dark. "Die, you bastard," he whispered in his ear, then took one last look at Valerie Clark, frozen in terror, and disappeared into the darkness. "Danny, son!" shouted the frightened nurse and rushed to the boy. Mary jumped out of the house at the scream, and when she saw what her ex had done to her fiancé, she immediately called an ambulance. The doctors arrived and immediately explained to the women that Danny urgently needed an operation and a transfusion. The man had lost a lot of blood while waiting for the medics. The doctor at the hospital immediately made a request to the regional blood donor center, but was refused. Material with such a rare group and phenotype they did not have. There was a small supply, but it ran out a week ago. Then the doctors started looking for a donor through the database, and finally they got lucky. There was one donor in town, a young businessman by the name of Nordling. The only snag was that he had already donated blood, and he needed a break. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Sam, that was the businessman's name, was to have a very important meeting in Moscow, and he had to be at the airport in an hour. However, the doctors, with great difficulty, still managed to persuade the businessman to come and save his life by donating his blood. There was no other person with similar, very rare blood parameters in the small town. After giving up everything, Sam arrived at the hospital, unable to pass by a man in distress. As Nordling walked down the hall to the transfusion room, Valerie Clark and Mary jumped out of their seats. "Danny," the nurse asked in astonishment. "God, how can that be? You're in the room right now." Mary looked at the older woman in amazement, and then they both understood. "Excuse me." The surprised businessman asked them again. "I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else." "I'm not Danny, I'm Sam." The fact was that the donor businessman was an exact replica of the homeless man who had been living with the former nurse. Valerie Clark realized that this man was the twin brother she had told her named son about, the one she had lost as a baby. When the nurse tried to explain this to the businessman, he at first did not believe it, but when he entered the room, he himself fell into a stupor. His mirror image was looking at him, lying now unconscious on the hospital bed. "It can't be," Sam whispered. "So it's true. I have a sibling." At that moment, Danny couldn't answer him, but Sam donated blood and saved his twin's life. The material matched perfectly, and the operation was a success. The surgeon later admitted to the businessman that if it hadn't been for his dedication, they would have lost Danny that night for sure. When the patient woke up and saw who had rescued him, the young man was astonished. He couldn't believe it was his closest friend, his own brother, standing in front of him. Sam looked up at him, smiling through his tears. "Brother," he said slowly, and walked over to Danny. "I still can't get over it." "How is that possible? We lived in the same town, and we've never even seen each other in all these years." Danny, who was as touched as his brother, only shook his head sadly. "Apparently, it was fate that we did not know about each other for a while. Did Valerie Clark tell you about everything? I'm sure you've got a lot on your mind," he nodded. "And the bride is beautiful too, and I heard you defended her from her deadbeat ex-husband." The brothers talked for a while, and then hugged each other. Sam promised his brother that he would visit him as soon as he recovered, and he kept his word. After he was discharged, he was greeted not only by the women he loved, but also by his brother in a luxury car. As it turned out, the former nurse was right. The businessman told her that he had been raised in an orphanage since childhood, from which he had been adopted by a wealthy family. He never knew about his brother, nor did the management of the orphanage where he grew up. This meant that the boy's mother had kept only Danny for herself at birth, while Sam had been dropped off at the orphanage door. The brothers held no grudge against their mother. Danny had explained to Sam how hard her life had been, so the businessman understood the motives for her action. Ethan was immediately apprehended by the police after the attempted murder of Danny. He had already sobered up and confessed. He was facing a trial and a long prison sentence. Ethan was also deprived of his parental rights, so Danny was free to adopt Joe right after his marriage to Mary. Sam, on the other hand, took Danny into his business. The former homeless man passed his driver's license, got his papers, learned his trade, and began working as a truck driver. After marrying Mary and adopting Joe, he felt like the happiest man on earth. Joe, after a year with Mary and his foster father, gradually stopped stuttering, surrounded by love and care. Mary considered it a miracle, especially since the boy, thanks to his companionship with the kindest Baxter, was no longer afraid of dogs. They are now best friends, and the dog, who had a beautiful kennel set up in the yard, just adores his little master. Valerie Clark is happy because now in her old age, she has a large, full family. She thought of Sam and Danny as her sons and Mary and Joe as her daughter and grandson. They are good friends with the family of her businessman brother, who also has a wife and a young daughter. The brothers are happy to have found each other after all these years and now support each other in everything, considering their meeting to be a gift from heaven. 6 months later, Mary told Danny the news that she was expecting a baby. Now, Joe would have a brother or sister, and Valerie Clark even cried tears of joy when she found out she was becoming a grandmother for the second time. Thus, after overcoming all the trials and hardships, each of these people found in their lives what they had dreamed of for so long, and what until that moment seemed to them absolutely unattainable.